The sounds of bones and gurgling of blood invades my dreams. With a wave of my arms, I summon skeletons to protect me from my enemies. Quickly, on the edge of my vision, an undulating mass of flesh rose from the ground. An arm consisting of the sinew of 10 different creatures picks me up and crushes my throat. As I watch my lifeless body crumple to the ground, my soul finds death, but I am not dead. I have found new life. I rise from my slumber. Another dream? Another fantasy? I pick a small travel mirror out of my pocket, only to stare at the gaunt face of a haunted man. Over the past months, my eyes have changed into 2 sunken sockets of blue, and my skin is pale beyond recognition as I hide from both the sun and my own nightmares and any tavern willing to take my coin. Most of all, my magics, once full of arcane power, are now attuned to a darker purpose. The last spell I cast was weeks ago, a common parlor trick meant to bedazzle a tavern in multicolored light, which instead misfired and sucked the blood dry from a man. And the part that haunted me, I liked it. I drain my mug of ale, leave my coin, and stumble out of the tavern into the darkness. The Scots Glen rains have already turned the dirt into mud, covering my boots with each footfall. Yes, I was like that same dirt, changed by some force of nature beyond my own reasoning. Changed into a haunted man who summons skeletons and drains blood from men. I would need a new name, a new title.
More the Necromancer.
Yes, I can hear your voices, my skeletal minions. That will do. Lemore the Necromancer. So, with Blizzard's recent June development update, we're finally starting to understand the core game design of Diablo 4, and I'm really excited about the Necromancer. Necromancers are returning from the dead, and it looks like the class design we're getting is a modern version of the Diablo 2 Necromancer. Necromancers have 2 resources, essences and corpses. Essence is your primary resource, which slowly restores itself automatically. Using basic skills also can grant you additional essence. As for corpses, when you kill your enemies, it will automatically leave behind a corpse, and that will power some of your strongest abilities, like Corpse Explosion. You can also create corpses from various effects. This opens the door for the Diablo 4 team to design legendary powers that give you additional corpses, or perhaps consume those corpses to power up your character in new and interesting ways. Now, in Diablo 2, this reliance on corpses can add sort of an annoying startup time to your character, as at the beginning of each game, you have to find a few weaker enemies to kill first before summoning your army. In Diablo 4, you'll still have a small amount of this warm-up time, as skeletons do require corpses to summon. However, this is an open world game, meaning that you don't have to join and leave games constantly, and also some of your basic skills or legendary abilities can create corpses, making the warm-up time significantly less of a problem than you've encountered in Diablo 2. What's more is that necromancers only have to dedicate 2 buttons to summoning their army, one for all of the skeletons that you have, and one for your golem. This leaves plenty of space for all of your other skills and makes Necromancer a bit more of a versatile class than one that's just focused on summons alone. So first, let's talk about how to read a Diablo 4 skill description. This will be really handy so that we can talk in detail about the Necromancer's skills. I love the design of these tooltips. Tooltips in ARPGs are critically important to informing the player about your character's powers, how your abilities do damage, or giving the player an intuitive sense just how bonuses stack and benefit your character. I sort of think of tooltips in a ARPG game as sort of like the card text on a card in any sort of trading card game. It's really important for just understanding sort of like the basic ideas of what's going on in the game. So let's take a look at this tooltip. First of all, you'll see that effects are now capitalized. So you might see vulnerable, stun, freeze, chill, healthy, these sorts of things. Numbers are also highlighted in color. Yellow, for example, here is highlighting some of the modifiers, but also you'll see this for raw damage numbers too that can get calculated here in the tooltip. Also note here that the X on some percentage-based increases exists here. We don't actually know what this is yet, but I have a good guess is that this might be multiplicatively calculated damage. This is a really important distinction for a lot of ARPG players, especially at the high end, to understand, as it's always a question if damage is calculated additively or multiplicatively when you're adding different effects together. Active effects are in white text, whereas inactive effects are in gray text. Just another very small design element that helps you understand what's actually happening with your character. Now, with that out of the way, let's deep dive into the Necromancer's skills. Now, many of these skills are not officially confirmed by Blizzard, and these are only available really by watching the gameplay. So I've taken the liberty of naming a few of these skills myself just so we can kind of have a conversation and a way to reference them. And when we talk about those, they'll appear on the screen and you'll see that I've noted that I've named them, so it's not the official name per se. Of course, keep in mind everything here is early in development and everything could change. Now, Necromancers have 3 different types of skills, and they also have the Book of the Dead for managing their undead army. I assume that each of these might map to the Necromancer's skill tree, but that's not confirmed yet. So we'll have to wait to see how these skills work with skill trees and legendary effects later on. Right, so first of all, we have bone skills. Bone skills give you lots of critical strike, or critical hit chance as it's known in other Diablo games. And when you critically strike, you also get unique critical effects. Mostly they're physical damage, and they also spend large amounts of essence. Next, you have darkness skills. Now, darkness skills do dot damage or damage over time. They also have debuffs and crowd control elements to them. And then finally, we have blood skills. Now, these siphon life from your enemies. These are more defensive skills. They turn kind of defense into offense, and they reward large amounts of maximum health. Now, what is a basic skill? So a basic skill is a skill for a class that generates their primary resource. You might be familiar with these from Diablo 3. I believe they're called generators and spenders in Diablo 3, but here they're called basic skills. So in general, basic skills are tuned to do sort of less damage and have less effects than other skills that actually spend your resources, right? That kind of makes sense. So the first one here, this one's called Bone Splinter. It looks like it's a basic skill. It looks like it's a bone skill, and it sprays 3 shards of bone in front of you. Decompose. This is a darkness skill. It channels dark magic onto enemies, dealing damage and generating essence. It also periodically summons corpses, making it easier to ensure you have a steady supply on hand for summoning skeletons. All right, and for our last basic skill, we have Reap. This looks like it could be a blood skill, perhaps. You swing a large scythe in melee range, dealing damage in a wide arc and potentially generating essence here if this is truly a basic skill. Okay, next, let's take a look at some of the regular skills. These require that you use essence or corpses to power them. So first up, we have our darkness regular skills. We have Blight. So what Blight does is it launches a ball of dark energy in a direction. Upon hitting an enemy, or if it expires, like the duration expires, it deals an explosion of damage while leaving behind a defiled area, dealing periodic damage to enemies inside over time. This skill deals a high amount of damage to enemies who are standing in place on that defiled area. And next up we have Iron Maiden. Iron Maiden being a curse coming from Diablo 2. So this covers a large area and a big pentagram. And I think it deals damage over time, just taking a look at the gameplay. It's really hard to tell without seeing a tooltip or trying it out myself. All right, now we have some bone skills. So first of all, this is a classic from Diablo 2. We have Bone Spirit. This has a long cooldown. It consumes all of the essence that the player currently has. And what it does is it sends out a homing bone spirit that seeks out the nearest enemy, and it explodes for high damage on the target, and it damages that target and any other enemies in the area, so it does an AoE. Now, the damage that you actually do is increased by a percentage of the essence that you spend. And it also has an upgrade here. When you critically strike with Bone Spirit, the cooldown is significantly reduced. So the idea here being generate a lot of essence really quickly, dump it all into Bone Spirit, reduce the cooldown, do it all again. All right, next up we have Bone Prison. Now this summons a circular wall of bone to surround the targeted enemy or area. It probably does a little bit of damage, but mostly this is for crowd control or for blocking space off. Enemies can't move through this space while the Bone Prison persists. It looks like we have Bone Spear making a return for Diablo 4. It's sort of hard to say how much damage this does, but I assume this is spending a good amount of essence here. And also there's an interesting thing happening here too, where we're seeing a bounce back effect when it hits a wall. So that's pretty interesting. I'm not sure if that's an upgrade or if that's just built into the Bone Spear. All right, next up we have something that looks sort of like bone armor or a upgrade of bone armor. This is summoning sort of a hurricane of bones around the Necromancer, increasing their defense and probably damaging nearby enemies who get too close. All right, finally, on the bone skills, we have this really cool looking skill. I'm calling this Skeletal Scythe. It summons this large skeletal reaper that deals damage to enemies with a scythe. It's hard to know what else it does, but it's being used infrequently here, so I assume this is spending some essence. All right, next up we have Blood Surge. This is a blood skill that draws a small amount of blood from nearby enemies, and then it expels a blood nova, dealing damage around the player. The damage of the blood nova is increased per enemy drained. So the way you really want to use this skill is you want to be in the middle of a big pack of enemies, and you want to maximize the amount of enemies that you're draining from to just do massive amounts of damage. And then next up we have Blood Mist. This is also a blood skill, and you disperse into a bloody mist, becoming temporarily immune to all damage while draining the life of any nearby enemies that you pass through. Now, if the goal of Blood Mist is to be a defensive skill, I'm not seeing it. Now, we're only going on this one clip, so maybe I'm not seeing the benefit of it, but there's a few problems with this skill that I think Blizzard should fix before it hits any sort of next testing phase. The first thing is that invulnerability mechanics generally are broken in Diablo games. Iframes are fine, but these kinds of invulnerability mechanics are either overpowered and overtuned, or they're laughably underpowered, especially if they're not a skill shot. The other main thing that we're seeing a lot in Diablo games is that teleports are always super advantageous. They let you avoid obstacles, they let you get the jump on people due to sort of like server latency and attacker advantage and that sort of thing. The other thing here is that regaining health in a Diablo game is typically a pretty low value proposition. So unless Diablo 4 has no potions, no life on hit, no life steal, no heal or regeneration mechanics, I really just don't see the defensive value of this ability, either on its life gain or its invulnerability. Generally in a Diablo game, when you have a defensive skill, you want a couple things to happen. You either want to have some sort of like block chance, right? You want to have some sort of dodge where you can avoid, basically you're avoiding damage. You're massively reducing the amount of damage that you have so that you can stand your ground, right? The other option that you want is a retreat option so that you can quickly outpace the enemies, move faster than them, whether that's through a teleporting mechanic, whether that's through increasing your movement speed, whatever that is. And I'm not really seeing either of those things here. All right, now we have a really cool skill. This one wasn't pointed out by Blizzard at all, so I'm calling this Blood Wall. This just summons a giant rolling wall of blood. I don't know if this is a blood golem skill or what's going on here, but it looks like it's going to do a ton of damage and or maybe even debuff the enemy. And then of course we've got Corpse Explosion. Now they don't even call out Corpse Explosion, so I'm assuming that this is Corpse Explosion, but you gotta assume that this does a large amount of damage, that it consumes one of those corpses on the ground and does an AoE. Now, one thing that you might not know if you haven't been watching Diablo 4 closely is that you can ride a mount around in the world, and when you dismount, you have a skill that you can cast to jump right into the fight. So I'm calling this a dismount skill. Maybe there's a better name for it, but that's what I'm calling it for now. Now, the Necromancer, it appears to have one of these skills. It looks like bone spikes, so this might allow the Necromancer hopefully to like jump into the fight, stun a few enemies so that they can summon a few things, maybe get their golem up, and then start snowballing their army forth, right? So they need to get like one little enemy killed so that they can get some of their skeletons up, or skeletal mages, and then kind of go from there. All right, now that leads us actually to looking at the Book of the Dead, the Necromancer's method of managing their undead army. So there's 3 types of minions for the Necromancer to manage. There's Skeletal Warriors, there's Skeletal Mages, and there's Golems. First up, we have Skeletal Warriors. There's also 3 types of these Skeletal Warriors that you can choose from: Skirmishers, Defenders, and Reapers. So first, Skirmishers. We actually don't know anything about Skirmishers except for one of the upgrades, which allows you to raise 1 additional Skirmisher. Besides that, we actually don't know anything else. We don't know the sacrifice ability, or what the other upgrade is, or even what Skirmishers really are supposed to do. Next up, we have Defenders. Now, Defenders are durable shield bearers with 15% increased life. They have 2 upgrades. The first one is every 10 seconds, your skeletal defenders negate the next instance of direct damage that they would take. And the second one is increase the amount of thorns that defender warriors inherit from you from 30 to 50%. You can also sacrifice your defenders to gain 15% non-physical resistance, but you can no longer raise skeletal warriors. And then the final category is the Reapers. We don't know anything about the skeletal Reapers yet, but hopefully we'll know something soon. All right, next up, we have Skeletal Mages. We have 3 kinds: Shadow, Cold, and Bone. Now, we don't know anything about the Shadow Skeletal Mages yet, but we do know Cold and Bone. So Cold chills and freezes enemies. It has 2 upgrades. The first one is each time your Cold Mages damage enemies with their primary attack, that you gain 2 essence. And the second one is enemies who are frozen by or damage while frozen by your Cold Mage's primary attack are made vulnerable for 3 seconds. Finally, you can sacrifice your Skeletal Mages to deal X 15% increased damage to vulnerable enemies, but you can no longer raise Skeletal Mages. All right, and then finally, we also have Bone Skeletal Mages. These use their own bones as projectiles, and they deal heavy damage for a life cost. So there's 2 upgrades here. The first is they reduce the life cost of your Bone Mage's attacks from 15% to 10%. And after being alive for 5 seconds, Bone Skeletal Mages deal 40% increased damage. The second one is each time a Bone Mage dies from its own attack, they leave behind a corpse and they fortify you for 2,188%, whatever that number means. Finally, you can sacrifice your Bone Skeletal Mages, and what that does is your overpower damage is increased by 30%, but you can no longer raise Skeletal Mages. We don't know what overpower means for Diablo 4 yet, but we'll get on that one soon. All right, finally we have Golems. So first up is the Bone Golem. This taunts enemies in a wide area. We have a couple of different upgrades that you can choose from here. The first one is each time your Bone Golem takes up to 20% of its maximum life as damage, it sheds a corpse. So great for generating extra corpses. The second one is your Bone Golem gains 10% maximum life, and the amount of thorns they inherit from you is increased from 30% to 50%. Finally, you can sacrifice your Bone Golem to gain 10% increased attack speed, but you lose the ability to summon a golem. Next up, we have the Blood Golem. This drains life from nearby enemies. It has a couple of upgrades for you to choose from. The first one is your Blood Golem absorbs 15% of the damage that you would take. And the second one is, while healthy, your Blood Golem gains 25% damage reduction and X 25% increased damage. If you sacrifice your Blood Golem, your maximum life is increased by 10%, but you lose the ability to summon a golem. Finally, we have the Iron Golem. This slams the ground and it stuns enemies. It has a couple upgrades for you to choose from. First is every 5th Iron Golem attack causes a shockwave, dealing 16% damage to the primary enemy and to enemies behind them. The second one is your Iron Golem slam attack also makes enemies vulnerable for 3 seconds. Finally, if you sacrifice your Iron Golem, you deal X 30% increased critical strike damage, but you lose the ability to summon a golem. Thanks for joining me on my first video for Diablo 4. If you want to see some more D4 content, please subscribe and leave a like on this video. And now that Blizzard has revealed all 5 classes for Diablo 4, tell me in the comments which one that you're going to play. Anyway, I'll see you in the next one. Peace.